word echoed in the cavernous, opulent space of the azure grill, sharp and sterile as the clink of a dropped silver fork. Terminated. It wasn't a shout, but a precisely enunciated whisper from the restaurant's general manager, Mr. Sterling, a man whose spine seemed to be starched along with his collar. The single word sliced through the hushed lunchtime ambiance, a death knell for Alara Vance's fragile existence. Tears, hot and immediate, blurred the crystal glassware and the indifferent faces of the patrons. Sterling's voice was a low, venomous drone, citing a litany of corporate statutes she had supposedly violated. Unauthorized meal compensation, direct breach of Aurelian Hospitality Group's financial conduct policy, Article 17, subsection B, endangerment of the establishment's fiscal integrity. Her crime, using $20 from her own pocket, money she had earmarked for her mother's overdue nursing home fees, to pay for the meal of an elderly man. A man with threadbare clothes, haunted eyes, and a hunger so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. A man who, after eating, had discovered his wallet was gone. As Sterling gestured for security, two imposing figures in ill-fitting suits, Ilara felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. They weren't just stares, they were verdicts. The pity from her fellow servers, the mild curiosity from the diners, the cold triumph from Sterling. She was being unmade in public, stripped of her livelihood for an act of simple, desperate empathy. But as the security guard's hand gently but firmly touched her elbow, a truth hung in the air, unknown and impossible. The disheveled old man she had helped was not who he appeared to be, and his return the following day would do more than just alter the trajectory of her life. It would detonate a scandal that would rock the foundations of the multi-billion-dollar Aurelian Hospitality Group, exposing a rot that went far deeper than a single manager's cruelty. The alarm on Alara Vance's phone was a gentle chime, a soft cascade of digital harp strings she had chosen to avoid jarring her mother on the rare weekends she could afford to bring her home. But at 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, in the oppressive silence of her tiny studio apartment, it sounded like a funeral dirge. For a long moment, she lay motionless, a prisoner of the pre-dawn darkness. Her body was a roadmap of aches from the previous night's double shift, a dull throb in her arches and a sharp complaint in her lower back. The air was thick with the scent of lavender potpourri, a small, futile attempt to mask the underlying odor of old plumbing and her own ever-present anxiety. This was her life, a relentless cycle of exhaustion and obligation. At 28, she possessed the weariness of a woman twice her age. The face that stared back from the cracked bathroom mirror was a pale sketch of the girl she used to be. The bright, inquisitive hazel eyes were now permanently shadowed, framed by the fine lines of chronic stress. Her dark hair, once a source of pride, was scraped back into a severe, functional bun, a style dictated by efficiency and corporate grooming standards. She was a senior waitress at the Azure Grill, a jewel in the crown of the Aurelian Hospitality Group. It was the kind of restaurant where the appetizers cost more than her weekly grocery budget. The job was a gilded cage. It offered just enough in wages and tips to keep her head above the churning waters of debt, to pay for the ever-increasing costs of the Meadowlark assisted living facility where her mother Eleanor was slowly being stolen away by dementia. The uniform was a crisp black dress, tailored to be elegant but constricting. As she buttoned it, her mind was already a whirlwind of calculations and checklists. Call Meadowlark about the payment plan. Pray that the radiator in the car holds out for another week. Remember the wine pairing for the new sea bass special, and above all, navigate the treacherous currents of Mr. Alistair Sterling. Sterling was more than a manager. He was a disciple of the corporate faith. He didn't walk, he glided, a shark in a Brioni suit. To him, patrons were not guests. They were revenue units. Staff were not a team. They were human capital assets. Every interaction was a potential data point. Every moment a metric to be measured. Table turnover rates, beverage upselling percentages, customer satisfaction scores. Empathy was a variable he had long since optimized out of his operational model. "Vance, your pour of the Sauvignon Blanc was 3/10 of an ounce over standard," he might murmur, his voice a silken threat. That's a projected loss of $62 over the fiscal quarter if replicated across all servers. Be mindful. Ilara forced down a piece of dry toast, chasing it with lukewarm coffee. On the small table next to the door sat a pile of well-worn books on local architecture and corporate history. It was her one indulgence, a remnant of a past life where she had been a history major with dreams of archival work. Now the books were just another layer of dust to wipe away. She grabbed her purse, the worn leather strap a familiar weight on her shoulder, and slipped out into the chilly gray embrace of the Boston morning. The Azure Grill was already a symphony of controlled chaos. The kitchen hummed with the quiet intensity of professionals, the air rich with the scent of simmering reductions and fresh bread. The other servers were polishing silver, their faces taut with a practiced, hollow cordiality. "Morning, Ilara," whispered Sarah, a younger waitress with perpetually nervous eyes. "He's in a mood today. The regional director, Mr. Davies, is coming for a surprise inspection." Ilara's stomach tightened into a cold knot. A visit from Davies meant Sterling would be amplified, his already obsessive scrutiny dialed up to an unbearable degree. Every plate, every greeting, every smile would be judged. It was a day for perfect, invisible servitude. "Terrific," Ilara muttered, tying the strings of her starched apron. "Just what the soul needs." The lunch service began, a blur of motion and memory. Ilara moved with a fluid, practiced grace, a ballet of efficiency. Her mind was a complex database of orders, allergies, and preferences. Mr. Albright in booth 6, steak frites, medium rare, extra sauce, and he'll want the Wall Street Journal. Mrs. Chen at table 12 is gluten-free and will ask for my recommendation, but always chooses the salmon. The party of 4 at table 9 are tourists, push the New England clam chowder. She was good. She was more than good. She was exceptional. Her secret weapon was a mind that retained details with an almost unnerving clarity. She remembered the names of her regulars' children, the anniversaries they celebrated, the specific vintage of wine they had enjoyed 6 months prior. It was this skill, this genuine and detailed attention, that earned her the tips that kept her mother in a safe place. Through it all, she felt Sterling's gaze, a constant pressure between her shoulder blades. She saw him make a note when she spent an extra 30 seconds explaining the charcuterie board to an elderly couple. She saw his eyebrow twitch when she had to stop to pick up a dropped napkin for a child. Each act of genuine human connection was, in his eyes, a deviation from optimal performance. By 1 o'clock, the main rush began to ebb. Ilara allowed herself a brief moment to lean against the service station, the burn in her feet a familiar fire. Her tips were good so far, but a quick mental tally told her she was still short of what she needed for the Meadowlark payment. The familiar vice of anxiety tightened around her chest. She needed one more big table, one more generous party. It was then, at exactly 1:23 p.m., that the heavy glass door of the Azure Grill swung open, and an old man stepped inside. He was an anomaly in this world of polished wood and hushed wealth. His tweed coat was frayed at the cuffs, his white hair was a disheveled silver halo, and his face was a tapestry of wrinkles that spoke of a long, hard life. He clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest and hesitated at the hostess stand, looking utterly lost, like a ghost from a different era. Sterling, standing near the bar, spotted him instantly. His posture stiffened, his lips thinning into a line of pure disdain. He began moving toward the man, a silent dismissal already forming on his face, ready to eject this piece of grit from his well-oiled machine. But Ilara's station was by the entrance. She saw him first. Their eyes met, and in the clear, startlingly intelligent blue of his, she saw not a problem to be removed, but a profound, soul-deep weariness mixed with a flicker of fear. On pure instinct, an impulse that defied all logic and self-preservation, she picked up a water carafe and a menu. She intercepted Sterling, stepping directly into his path, with a seamless pivot that suggested she was merely on her way to a table. With a small, professional smile that didn't quite reach her panicked eyes, she addressed the old man. "Right this way, sir," she said, her voice a calm island in the storm of Sterling's brewing fury. "We have a quiet table for you by the window." The old man looked from the approaching manager to Ilara, a flicker of surprise and then immense relief washing over his features. He gave a slow, grateful nod. Sterling stopped dead, his face a mask of controlled rage. A silent, vicious war had just been declared in the opulent lobby of the Azure Grill, and Alara, armed with nothing but a water glass and a flicker of decency, had just fired the first shot. The old man slid into the plush leather of the booth, his movements careful, almost pained. He placed his worn satchel on the seat beside him, with a tenderness one might reserve for a sleeping child. He stared at the menu Alara presented, but his gaze was unfocused, his mind seemingly miles away. The faint tremor in his hands was the only betrayal of his inner state. From his position by the bar, Sterling's glare was a physical force. Alara could feel it prickling her skin. She had committed an act of insubordination by seating this man, a guest who so clearly fell outside their target demographic. They both knew it. She approached the table, her notepad poised. "May I get you something to start? Coffee or perhaps some iced tea?" The man looked up, and again she was struck by the sharpness of his blue eyes. They were the eyes of a scholar, a thinker, clouded by a fog of exhaustion. "Water would be fine. Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice a low, cultured rumble, raspy with disuse. When she returned, he was looking out the window, his reflection a stark contrast to the gleaming luxury cars gliding past on the street. He seemed to be studying the architecture of the building opposite, a historic landmark she knew well from her books. "Are you ready to order, sir?" Alara asked, her tone gentle. He started, as if pulled from a trance. "Oh, yes." He looked down at the menu, at the dizzying prices, and a faint flush of color rose on his paper-thin cheeks. He met her eyes, and there was a profound, heartbreaking shame in his. "I'm afraid my appetite isn't what it once was," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the table. "What would you recommend for someone looking for something simple and nourishing?" Ilara's heart constricted. It was a well-practiced dance of dignity, a question she had heard from countless people trying to mask their financial constraints. Policy dictated she should steer him towards a high-margin salad or soup. But this felt different. She thought of her mother, who on her bad days would ask for something simple and from before. "The chef makes a cassoulet for the staff lunch," she said, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's not on the menu. White beans, duck confit, sausage. It's rich, but it's exactly what the soul needs on a chilly day. I could bring you a generous bowl. We'll just call it the soup of the day." His head lifted, his expression one of astonishment, then a slow, dawning gratitude that was more potent than any lavish tip. "The cassoulet," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That sounds perfect. Thank you." As Alara turned toward the kitchen, she felt Sterling's presence directly behind her. "What was that about?" he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "The gentleman has a delicate stomach, Mr. Sterling. I recommended the soup of the day," she replied smoothly, not breaking stride. "The soup of the day is a chilled cucumber and avocado bisque. And he is not a gentleman, Vance. He is a liability. I want him served and gone. Expedite it." "Of course, Mr. Sterling," she said, her own voice betraying none of the cold fury that was building inside her. The man who introduced himself as Julian ate the cassoulet with a slow, reverent pace. He wasn't just eating, he was experiencing the food, savoring each spoonful with a focused intensity that was almost meditative. He ate with the quiet refinement of a man accustomed to fine dining, a strange counterpoint to his shabby attire. Alara continued her duties, but she was acutely aware of Julian's quiet observation. He wasn't just looking, he was seeing. He saw her deftly handle a complaint about a corked wine, her calm explanation and swift replacement earning a nod of respect from the disgruntled customer. He saw her notice a regular diner, a recent widow sitting alone, and watched as Alara took a moment to ask about her cat by name, a small gesture that brought the first real smile to the woman's face all day. He saw her meticulously correcting a billing error on another table, her finger tracing lines of figures on the check with an expert's precision, a skill no one else would have noticed. He also witnessed, with growing clarity, the oppressive atmosphere created by Sterling. He saw the manager publicly berate a young busboy for stacking plates in the wrong order, the boy flushing with shame. He overheard Sterling's clipped, demeaning remarks to Sarah, the nervous waitress. He was not just observing a restaurant, He was observing a kingdom ruled by fear. When Julian had finished, scraping the last of the rich sauce from his bowl with a piece of bread, he sat for a long while simply looking out the window again. Finally, with a sigh, he signaled for the check. Ilara brought it in a small leather folio. "No hurry at all, sir," she said with a warm smile. He returned the smile faintly. He reached into his tweed coat, patting the pockets. His expression shifted from placid to puzzled. He began to search more methodically, his hands moving from his coat to his trousers. The puzzle morphed into alarm, then into raw, unadulterated panic. His breath grew shallow, his movements frantic. "Is everything all right, Julian?" Ilara asked, her smile vanishing. "My wallet," he whispered, his voice trembling. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto hers. "It's gone. I must have left it in the taxi. Or it was stolen. I have no money. I can't pay." He looked utterly broken, a man whose last shred of dignity had just been stripped from him. He began to rise, his face ashen. "I am so terribly sorry. I'll go." This was the precipice. Aurelian Hospitality Group policy was not just clear, it was biblical. In the event of a customer's inability to pay, an employee was to offer no opinion, make no arrangement. They were to immediately and discreetly signal the manager on duty. Mr. Sterling would then handle the asset recovery situation, a euphemism that usually involved the police. It was a zero-tolerance policy designed to eliminate loss and liability. Ilara looked at the horrified man before her. Then she glanced across the room. Sterling was watching them. He hadn't heard the words, but he could read the scene. His eyes narrowed, a predator sensing a kill. She knew the correct, safe, self-preserving action. Raise her hand. Summon Sterling. Let the cold, unforgiving gears of the corporation grind this man into dust over a $20 bowl of stew. She thought of her mother. She thought of the overdue bill from Meadowlark. She thought of the precariousness of her own life, how one missed paycheck, one unexpected car repair could send her spiraling into the same abyss of desperation that Julian now faced. And then she looked back at him, at the profound humiliation radiating from him like a physical heat. Her own struggles did not harden her heart, they shattered it. She understood. In a single life-altering heartbeat, she made her choice. She placed a calming hand on his arm, urging him back into his seat. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice a fragile shield against the world. "Please, don't worry. Just stay here for a moment." Before he could argue, she turned and walked away, not towards the manager, but towards the POS terminal, her hand slipping into the apron pocket where she kept the cash that was supposed to save her mother. Ilara's pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every fiber of her being, conditioned by years of precarious employment, screamed at her to turn back, to follow the rules, to protect herself. But the image of Julian's face, the raw shame, the terror, eclipsed all else. Her fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, closed around the meager wad of bills in her apron. 2 20s, a 5, and a few singles. It was her lifeline. Gas money, grocery money, the co-payment for her mother's next prescription. It was the sum total of her security in the world. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, she pulled out one of the $20 bills. The check was for $18.50 plus tax, totaling $22. She would use her own money, ring it through as a cash payment. Julian could leave with his dignity intact. Sterling would see a closed-out table, and she would survive to fight another day. It seemed like a flawless, compassionate deception. She reached the service terminal, her back deliberately angled away from Sterling. She swiftly entered the table number, selected the cash payment option, and hit the button to open the drawer. The electronic cha-ching sounded unnaturally loud in the tense dining room. "And what precisely do you think you're doing, Vance?" The voice was a shard of ice against the back of her neck. Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the open cash drawer, the $20 bill clutched in her palm. She turned slowly. Mr. Sterling stood inches behind her, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold, intellectual fury. I was just closing out table 9, Mr. Sterling," she lied, her voice thin and unconvincing. "With what funds?" Sterling's voice was dangerously quiet. I have been monitoring that table since you seated him against my better judgment. The man informed you he could not pay. I saw the entire exchange. And yet, you failed to signal me, as per protocol. Ilara's mind scrambled for a plausible excuse. He found his money. It was in his satchel. It was a feeble fabrication, and it disintegrated under Sterling's withering stare. Show me your hand, Sterling commanded. Ilara hesitated. Mr. Sterling, this is unnecessary. Now, Vance, or my next call will be to corporate security to resolve this matter. Defeated, she unclenched her fist. The crumpled $20 bill lay on her palm, a testament to her transgression. Sterling's gaze flickered from the bill to the cash drawer, then back to her face. A slow, triumphant smile, the smile of a predator that has finally cornered its prey, spread across his lips. This was what he had wanted, an unambiguous, fireable offense. So, that's your game, he said, his voice rising, pitching itself to be heard by the nearby tables. The hushed conversations began to falter as diners and staff turned to watch. You're conducting unauthorized transactions with personal funds, a flagrant violation of Aurelian Group Policy 17B, which expressly forbids the commingling of employee and company assets to settle a guest's account. He recited the policy number as if it were a sacred text. The dining room was falling silent. At his table, Julian watched, his face a canvas of horror and disbelief. He made a move to stand, to protest, but Ilara shot him a tiny, desperate shake of her head. His intervention would only engulf him in the fire. He was hungry and he couldn't pay, Ilara pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. It was $20. What was I supposed to do? Have him arrested for a bowl of cassoulet? You were supposed to follow procedure, Sterling snapped, his voice now a public proclamation. Procedure exists to protect this establishment from fraud and theft. What if every server took it upon themselves to run their own personal charity? Do you hand out free bottles of Dom Perignon to anyone with a sob story? You have willfully disobeyed a direct order, violated financial protocol, and fundamentally undermined my authority as manager of this restaurant. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. Her cheeks burned with a feverish heat. She could feel the stares, pitying, curious, judgmental. This was a spectacle. Sterling was making an example of her. I paid for it, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a sliver of defiance. The company lost nothing. In fact, you still made a profit on the ingredients. This was a critical error. The mention of profit, of her understanding his world better than he thought, enraged him. This is not about profit, he thundered, his face contorted. This is about order. It is about discipline. It is about ensuring that every asset, human or otherwise, operates within the parameters set forth by the Aurelian Group. You have proven yourself to be an unstable, emotionally compromised liability. He took a theatrical step back, his posture becoming rigid, official. He was no longer a manager. He was a judge delivering a sentence. Ilara Vance, he announced, his voice ringing with a cold, devastating finality. Effective immediately, your employment with the Aurelian Hospitality Group is terminated. You are fired. The word hung in the silent air, obscene and brutal. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Alistair, you can't, Ilara choked out, the tears finally breaking free. Please, my mother, I need this job. You should have considered your personal obligations before you decided to play savior to a vagrant, Sterling retorted, his voice devoid of any warmth. Remove your apron. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Collect your personal effects from your locker. Security will escort you from the premises. Numbly, Ilara's fingers fumbled with the knot of her apron. The crisp black fabric felt like a lead shroud. She folded it and placed it on the service counter, a final act of defeated professionalism. Her gaze drifted past Sterling, across the silent watching room, and landed on Julian. He was on his feet now, his fists clenched, his face pale with a rage that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He looked like he wanted to burn the whole world down. But what could he do? He was a penniless old man, the unwitting catalyst for her ruin. Their eyes locked one last time, and in his she saw a promise. A silent, furious vow that she could not possibly comprehend. As the security guards led her away, the silence was broken by the sound of Julian's voice, no longer raspy but clear and commanding, ringing through the restaurant. "Sterling!" he called out. The manager turned, an expression of annoyance on his face. On the table where the check had been, now lay a single crisp $100 bill. Next to it, Julian had placed a platinum credit card. The name embossed on it was not Julian. It was Julian Croft. "Put my meal and the meals of everyone in this restaurant on this card," he commanded, "and add a $10,000 tip. Instruct the staff to divide it equally amongst themselves, except, of course, for the manager." He looked directly at Sterling, his blue eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Because I have a feeling he won't be needing it for very long." The walk home was a disembodied nightmare. Elara floated through the familiar city streets, the sounds of traffic and life muted as if she were moving through water. The phantom sensation of her apron ties still lingered around her waist. The heat of Sterling's public condemnation still burned on her cheeks. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the path she had taken just that morning, a lifetime ago. The 4 flights of stairs to her apartment were a Sisyphean trial. Each step was a monumental effort, her legs shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline and despair. Her key scraped against the lock, her trembling hands refusing to obey. Finally, with a jolt, the lock turned. She pushed the door open and stepped into the suffocating silence of her home. She stood frozen in the tiny entryway, her purse slipping from her numb fingers and hitting the linoleum with a dull final thud. The full, crushing weight of her reality descended. Terminated. The word wasn't just an echo anymore. It was the new wallpaper, the new air she breathed. Fired for $20. Fired for a moment of kindness. She collapsed onto the lumpy sofa, the springs groaning a weary chorus. The tears had been exhausted on the journey home, leaving a barren, aching void. Her mind, however, was a maelstrom. Rent was due in 10 days. Mr. Henderson, her landlord, was a kind but firm old man who relied on her rent to pay his own mortgage. Then there was Meadowlark. The call she now had to make explaining that the overdue payment would be even later was a prospect so humiliating it made her physically sick. And her mother's medication. A raw, primal panic began to constrict her throat. She wrapped her arms around her torso, a desperate attempt to hold herself together as her world disintegrated. She had been a model employee, meticulous, reliable, always willing to take an extra shift. She had swallowed Sterling's condescension, endured the long hours, sacrificed her own well-being, all for this job, and it had all been erased in a single, cruel moment. Her gaze fell upon a dusty bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spines of her history books. One in particular caught her eye. Titans of Industry, the Aurelian Story. She had bought it years ago, fascinated by the story of the company's founder, the legendary Alistair Croft. He was a visionary who built an empire from a single diner, a man famous for his mantra. A business is not a balance sheet, it's a family. You take care of your people, and the profits will take care of themselves. What had happened to that company? How had it devolved into this soulless machine run by men like Sterling? A memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. Her father. He had been a chef, a brilliant culinary artist with a passion for innovation. He had worked for an Aurelian restaurant 20 years ago, a different one, a more casual bistro. He had developed a signature sauce, a complex smoky reduction that became a bestseller. The company promised him a bonus, a percentage of the profits from the dish. But the paperwork was always in process, the promises always deferred. A new manager came in, a man much like Sterling, who claimed the recipe was company property. Her father, a proud and trusting man, had no legal proof. He was eventually let go for redundancy. The sauce, slightly modified, was still on the menu at dozens of Aurelian bistros across the country. The injustice had broken him. Not the money, but the theft of his creation, the cold corporate denial of his contribution. He lost his spark, drifted from one kitchen to another, and died far too young from a heart attack his doctors attributed to stress. The irony was suffocating. The same faceless entity, the same culture of exploitation had now claimed her too. It was a vicious, repeating cycle, a legacy of corporate greed that had devoured her family. A new emotion, fierce and cleansing, burned through the numbness. Rage. This wasn't just about a lost job. This was about her father. It was about every dishwasher, every busboy, every server treated as a disposable cog in an unfeeling machine. She stood up and walked to the small desk, crammed into a corner of the room. Under a pile of bills was a folder. Inside were her father's old notebooks, filled with his elegant handwriting, detailing recipes and kitchen inventories. She had kept them for sentimental reasons, but now she looked at them with a new intensity. Tucked into the back was a thin file of papers, his old employment contract, a few commendation letters, and his final curt termination notice. It was signed by the regional director at the time, a man named Arthur Davies, the same Arthur Davies who was inspecting the Azure Grill today. The name hit her like a physical blow. The threads of the past and present were not just parallel, they were tangled into a monstrous, suffocating knot. She sank into her chair, the weight of this new revelation almost too much to bear. It wasn't just random cruelty, it felt like a curse. As the afternoon sun slanted through the grimy window, casting long prison bar shadows across the room, Alara Vance felt a chilling, profound certainty that she was trapped in a story someone else had written long ago. While Alara's world contracted to the four walls of her apartment, another, vastly different world was in the midst of an earthquake. Julian Croft, or as he was known to the world, Julian Alistair Croft II, chairman and CEO of the Aurelian Hospitality Group, sat in the silent, temperature-controlled luxury of his Bentley. The scent of Italian leather and polished burr walnut was an obscene contrast to the memory of cassoulet and desperation. The ragged clothes were gone, replaced by an immaculately tailored Savile Row suit, but the transformation was purely cosmetic. Inside, he was still the man from the booth, a maelstrom of shame, fury, and a terrifying, unfamiliar clarity. He hadn't intervened. Not really. The grand gesture with the credit card was a salve for his conscience, not a solution for her. He had sat there, a king in beggar's clothing, and watched a woman of immense character and kindness be ritually sacrificed on the altar of a corporate policy he himself had signed into law. This whole incognito charade, Project Chimera, as his PR team had branded it, was supposed to be a carefully managed publicity stunt, a way to reconnect with his father's legacy, to generate a feel-good story for the shareholders about the CEO who still walked the floor. He had resisted it for months, viewing it as a sentimental waste of time. He was a man of numbers, of acquisitions and mergers, of sweeping strategic visions. The day-to-day operations of a single restaurant were, he had believed, beneath his notice. His father's words echoed in his memory. A company's soul, Julian, isn't in the annual report. It's in the way the dishwasher is treated when he breaks a plate. He had thought he would find minor inefficiencies, perhaps a lazy manager, problems that could be solved with a memo. Instead, he had found Alara Vance, and he had found Alistair Sterling. Sterling wasn't an anomaly, he was the platonic ideal of the modern Aurelian manager. A man who embodied the ruthless, metric-driven culture Julian had cultivated over the past 2 decades, a culture that had systematically dismantled his father's family and replaced it with assets. Alara, with her defiant humanity, was the system error he had been trying to eliminate. The Bentley glided to a stop before the Croft Tower, a skyscraper of smoked glass and steel that pierced the Boston skyline. It had always been a symbol of his power. Tonight, it felt like a monument to his failure. In his penthouse office, with the city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board of distant lights, he felt a profound isolation. He had reached the pinnacle and discovered there was nothing there but a view. "Get me Arthur Davies on a secure line. Now!" he snapped into the intercom, his voice a low growl. "And I want the complete personnel files for an employee named Alara Vance and a manager named Alistair Sterling from the Azure Grill. I also want you to pull the historical employment archives. I'm looking for a chef named Vance from about 20 years ago. Check all bistros in the Boston area. He paced the vast expanse of his office, his handmade leather shoes sinking into the silk carpet. He could not shake the image of Alara's face as Sterling delivered the final blow. The mention of her mother, the quiet dignity with which she had absorbed the humiliation. He had created a world where a woman's ability to care for her ailing parent could be severed over a $20 act of grace. The thought was vile. His assistant buzzed. "Mr. Davies is on line 1, sir, and the files are being uploaded to your tablet." Julian snatched the receiver. "Arthur," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Julian Croft. I've just spent my afternoon at the Azure Grill. Tell me about your star manager, Alistair Sterling." Davies, a man whose career was built on sycophancy, was clearly thrown. "Mr. Croft, sir. An honor. Sterling is a top performer, a true asset. He's increased profit margins by 12% this quarter alone. His numbers are impeccable." "His numbers are," Julian agreed, his voice turning to ice. "But his staff turnover rate is the highest in the northeastern United States. He runs that restaurant like a gulag. Is that the kind of impeccable performance you reward?" There was a choked silence on the other end of the line. "Well, sir, in this labor market, high turnover is not uncommon. He delivers on the bottom line. That's been the key metric we've been incentivized to prioritize." Incentivized to prioritize. The words were a dagger in Julian's gut. Davies was right. This wasn't a Sterling problem or a Davies problem. The rot started here, in this office, with him. "We're going to have a long talk about your incentive programs tomorrow, Arthur. Be in my office." 7 a.m., Julian said, and disconnected the call. He opened his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. Alara Vance's file was unremarkable, hired 4 years ago. A single commendation for excellent customer feedback. No disciplinary actions. Emergency contact. Eleanor Vance, Meadowlark Assisted Living. Then he opened the historical archive. There it was. Thomas Vance, former executive chef, Aurelian Bistro on Beacon Hill. Terminated 20 years ago. Reason: failure to comply with corporate intellectual property directives. The termination notice was signed by Arthur Davies. Julian stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening clang. This wasn't a random act of cruelty he had witnessed. It was the second act of a tragedy his company had written 2 decades ago. He hadn't just observed an injustice. He had stumbled into the bitter harvest of his own corporation's history. A deep, soul-shaking shame washed over him, so potent it made him nauseous. It was followed by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was not something that could be fixed with a check or a quiet settlement. This required a public demolition, a reckoning. He buzzed his assistant again, his voice now calm, infused with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Cancel my 7 a.m. with Davies. Tell him to meet me at the Azure Grill instead, at 9 a.m. sharp, and get me the number for a woman named Alara Vance. I need to make a personal call." The next morning, an uneasy truce held sway over the Azure Grill. Sterling patrolled the floor with the smug aura of a conquering hero, his authority now absolute. The staff moved with the quiet, fearful precision of a cowed populace. Alara's absence was a gaping wound, a silent testament to the price of dissent. At precisely 9 a.m., the glass door opened. Sterling turned, a plastic smile of welcome freezing on his face. It was Arthur Davies, the regional director, looking pale and nervous. And behind him, walking with an air of grim purpose, was Julian Croft. Not the disheveled old man from the day before, but the titan of industry from the cover of Fortune magazine. The staff froze. Spoons stopped polishing. Glasses halted mid-swipe. The low murmur of preparation died instantly. Mr. Croft," Sterling stammered, his face draining of all color, his mind frantically trying to reconcile the image of the vagrant with the billionaire standing before him. I had no idea." "What an honor to have you, sir." "Honor is not a word I would use to describe my experience here yesterday, Sterling," Julian said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. His cold blue eyes swept over the manager, then to Davies. "I came to one of my restaurants looking for a simple meal, for a moment of peace. Instead, I was given a front row seat to the diseased, rotten culture that you, Davies, have cultivated and that you, Sterling, have perfected. He took a step forward, his presence commanding the space. I saw a manager who bullies his staff, who values policy above human decency, and who publicly humiliates and fires an exemplary employee, the best employee in this building, for an act of compassion that should be the very foundation of this company. Sterling was visibly trembling now. Sir, I was enforcing company policy. The handbook. I am not interested in the handbook. Julian's voice cracked like a whip. I am interested in the fact that the woman you fired, Ilara Vance, is the daughter of Thomas Vance. A chef this company cheated and discarded 20 years ago. An injustice overseen by you, Davies. Davies looked as if he might faint. The full, horrifying scope of the situation was crashing down upon him. This wasn't a spot check. It was an execution. Julian's gaze softened slightly as he looked at the terrified staff. None of you have anything to fear. The problem is not here on the floor. It is in the executive suites, and that is about to change. He pulled out his phone and dialed. He put it on speaker. After 2 rings, a cautious, weary voice answered. Hello? Ms. Vance? Ilara Vance? Julian asked, his own voice now gentle. There was a long pause. Yes, who is this? My name is Julian Croft. We met yesterday. I was the man at the table by the window. I believe I owe you for a bowl of cassoulet. The silence on the other end was thick with shock and confusion. I don't understand. I know, and I am more sorry than words can convey for what my company has put you and your family through. Not just yesterday, but for the last 20 years. What you did for me was a moment of grace in a world I have helped to make graceless, and you were punished for it. He took a breath. Ilara, I am at the restaurant now. I need to ask you to come here. I've sent a car for you. It should be arriving any moment. It's time we settled my company's debt to your family, in person. He ended the call and turned his glacial stare back to the 2 managers. Now, Julian Croft said, his voice heavy with the weight of impending judgment. We wait. Ilara entered the Azure Grill as if walking onto a stage in the middle of a play she didn't know she was in. The 30-minute ride in the back of a silent, gleaming town car had been a surreal limbo, giving her mind just enough time to cycle through 1,000 improbable scenarios, none of which came close to the reality awaiting her. Her former co-workers stood in stunned, silent clusters. Alistair Sterling and a man she recognized as the regional director, Arthur Davies, were seated at a table, rigid and pale as statues. And standing in the center of the room, radiating an aura of absolute power, was Julian Croft. The transformation was absolute. The weary, humble man was gone, replaced by a titan whose gaze seemed to take in the entire world and find it wanting. He saw her, and his severe expression softened instantly with something that looked like genuine, profound remorse. He crossed the room to meet her, stopping a respectful few feet away. Ilara, he began, his voice now smooth and resonant, was filled with an unfamiliar emotion. Thank you for coming. I know this must be incredibly confusing. Before another word is said, I need to apologize. What was done to you yesterday was not just an injustice. It was the catastrophic failure of an organization that has my name on it. There is no policy, no protocol that can ever excuse it. You're Julian Croft, she stated, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I am, he confirmed, his eyes holding hers. And for too long, I have been a CEO, but not a leader. I manage a portfolio, not a people. I'd forgotten the lesson my father tried to teach me, that our business isn't about the food on the plate, it's about the people who serve it. You reminded me of that. Your courage, your integrity. You held on to your humanity when this company gave you every reason not to. He gestured to a quiet booth, the very one where he had sat the day before. Please. She slid into the booth, her movements stiff with shock. He sat opposite her, not as a customer, but as a penitent. When I looked into your file last night, he continued, his voice low and serious, I found your father's name, Thomas Vance. Ilara flinched, the old wound tearing open. You fired him. You took his recipe and threw him away. Her voice was quiet but sharp with the pain of a 2-decade-old betrayal. Julian did not look away. He absorbed the accusation without defense. Yes, he said, the word heavy with shame. We did. Arthur Davies, the man over there, signed the letter. But I was a young executive on the board then. I knew about it. I saw the profit reports from that new signature sauce. I heard the whispers, and I did nothing. I chose the path of least resistance, of corporate loyalty over human decency. It was one of the first of many compromises that led me and this company to where we are today. I cannot overstate the depth of my regret, not only for what we did to him, but for my own cowardly silence. Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of validation, of a long-held family grief being seen and named for the first time. I cannot change the past, Alara, Julian said, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the table. I cannot give you back your father, but I can make a promise to you right now. His legacy and your extraordinary act of grace will be the crucible in which the new Aurelian group is forged. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I did not bring you here to offer you your job back. That would be an insult. I am creating a new position, effective today. It will be an independent office within the corporation, reporting directly and only to me, the Office of Corporate Integrity. Its mandate will be to review and dismantle every policy that puts profit before people, to establish robust employee support systems, and to serve as an internal watchdog, ensuring that an injustice like the one done to your father and to you can never happen again. We will establish a fund to retroactively compensate former employees who were wronged by our policies. We will begin with Thomas Vance. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a powerful, compelling sincerity. And I want you to lead it. I want you to be its first executive director. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Alara stared at him, speechless. Director? Her? Me? She finally managed to say. I'm a waitress. I have half a history degree. I don't know the first thing about running a corporate department. You know the difference between right and wrong, Julian countered immediately. You have first-hand knowledge of the human cost of our failures. You have a mind for detail. I watched you yesterday. You see things no one else does, and you have the courage to defy a broken system. Those are the only qualifications that matter. I will give you any resource you require. A team of lawyers, accountants, HR specialists, an unlimited budget, and a salary that will ensure your mother receives the best care in the world for the rest of her days. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. I'm not offering you a job, Alara. I'm asking you to be my conscience, to help me tear down the company I built and rebuild the one my father dreamed of. Across the restaurant, Sterling and Davies watched, their careers dissolving before their very eyes. They were relics of an old order that had just been rendered extinct. Alara looked at Julian Croft, the man whose hunger she had fed. She thought of her father's faded notebooks, of her mother's fragile health, of the relentless, soul-crushing struggle that had been her life. And for the first time in a very long time, she saw a path forward, not just a way out, but a way up. A chance to give meaning to all the suffering, to honor her father's memory, not as a victim, but as a catalyst for justice. A slow, steadying strength filled her. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. All right, she said, her voice clear and firm. Yes, I'll do it. A profound relief washed over Julian Croft's face, the expression of a man who had just been granted a reprieve he knew he didn't deserve. The Azure Grill, the stage for her humiliation, had just become the birthplace of her ascent. A revolution had begun, not with a boardroom coup, but with a bowl of stew, an act of kindness, and a woman who had refused to let the world extinguish her light.